Hi, we are here today with our friend Meghan Riordan Jarvis and are going to have a great discussion on a very important topic on what happens to your body physically and otherwise through grief. And it's an important subject. If you're not ready to have that conversation yet, feel free to come back when you are. But one thing we'd like to encourage you to do is maybe share this with somebody that's in your close circle of trust that may know you well. This information can be helpful to them as they help you.
So I live in Washington, D.C., just outside with my husband, my 3 kids. They're all teenagers. And I work in the field of grief and loss. I have for 20 years. I trained as a trauma therapist. I had one of those careers where I sort of back-ended my way by going to therapy and then wanting to become a therapist. And there's lots of branches of therapy that you can sort of find your way into. In my childhood, there was a really significant death of a teenager who was beloved to the small town that I grew up in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And I didn't really understand until I went to therapy myself how deeply that loss and the way that we handled things in 1983, which was to not really talk about things, how deeply so much of who I became and how I felt about myself in the world was sort of connected to what a therapist defined for me as a trauma. So I trained to become a therapist, and I've done, worked as a private practitioner for 20 years. And in DC, that means working with people who have seen all kinds of trauma. There's plenty of, therapy clients in DC for me to work with. And in 2017, my dad died of small cell cancer. He was diagnosed in 2016. He died pretty much, as the doctor said, 1 year after his diagnosis. And my dad and I had an interesting sort of, not contentious, but not very close relationship. We were not very similar. And there was a gift in knowing that he was dying. He and I spent a lot of time together, a lot of easy time together, a lot of peaceful time together. And so what I always say is I participated in his death, and he was with me for that. So his death was really sad and hard, but it wasn't traumatizing. And in 2019, so just 2 years later, I was on vacation at my mother's house in Cape Cod, where I grew up, and she died suddenly in her sleep. The most beautiful, peaceful death. She was in her favorite pajamas, holding her rosary, and went to sleep and didn't wake up. Exactly how you would want someone you love to die. And it completely traumatized me. I immediately, when I discovered that she died, had a thought in my head, which was, it's my fault she died because I was with her. And I had PTSD after she died, and I ended up checking myself into the same facility that I check my clients into when they are really struggling and, our regular sessions aren't enough. So it was a very humbling and illuminative. I embodied what I was teaching my clients. So I had a clinical knowledge and some childhood knowledge, but I came out of treatment really passionate about what I understood differently. Grief isn't a mental health problem. It's a developmental stage that everyone goes through, but it does have a series of physical things that happen.
For about a month after my dad died, there was a special at the grocery store on Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and you could buy the pints for like $2, and it was super cheap. And so I stocked up. I would sit on the couch by myself, and I remember always telling myself, I'm only going to eat a quarter of this, and then I would eat the entire pint.
Sure.
And then I would repeat it again the next night. It was very abnormal for me, and I would do it again and again and again. Maybe if you could talk to that on a high level, not necessarily my issue specifically, but just when people are feeling physically out of sorts, what is going on in our bodies at that time?
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that, because you're normalizing immediately something that people end up having shame about, which is that they're reaching for something that actually has wisdom. So there's sugar and fat in ice cream, and those things create a hormonal experience with your neurotransmitters, which are soothing. And there are some people out there that say that that is sort of, ice cream is almost the equivalent of what babies get when they breastfeed in terms of fat and caloric content. So that someone would instinctively, even though it was odd for them, seek out ice cream has wisdom in it. And so when we can say that to folks, like, yeah, if you find yourself eating more carbs than normal, carbs go into the system and are processed in a way that create a response that generate neurotransmitters of soothing. So is it great overall for your waistline and your cholesterol and all of those other things? Maybe not. But when we're trying to do something incredibly hard and you are instinctively reaching for something, I always ask, is there wisdom in this?
Wow.
Is there something in this? But to give a really basic neuroscience, just, overview, death is literally the most terrifying experience. We are hardwired to avoid it.
Yeah.
And so particularly if it is a sudden piece of information that you get, someone that you love has died and you learn that, your body goes into, it's almost like a garage door slamming shut.
Yeah.
It has a series of defenses that it operates to protect you. And to sort of give it in a broad brush, the mind and the body are connected by our 10th cranial nerve. It's a super highway. And so we have 12 cranial nerves. 11 of them are coming from our brain, sending information down into the body. And then one of them is sending information from the body up into the brain. But when you get terrible news, and this will be familiar to grievers, your instincts, so your fight, flight, freeze, and collapse responses activate. And when they activate, they enlarge certain parts of your brain, and that enlargement causes the messages that would normally go like mail from the mailman into the right boxes, either to not get delivered or to get delivered to the wrong place. So you may have this experience, I'm sure people listening have. They get a terrible piece of news and then they have an awful thought. I had this when my grandfather died. I learned my grandfather died. I was a teenager. The very first thing I thought was, oh, I'm going to miss my orientation to high school. And then I felt terrible about that thought until I was 23 years old and learned your brain misfires. So when the brain sends signals from those 11 cranial nerves down into the body, they're all messed up and they're not going and sending the right cues. So when people aren't eating, it's usually because their hypothalamus hasn't been getting the messages and so isn't sending the right messages.
A lot of people are concerned with memory loss and trouble sleeping. Is that something that people should be concerned with, or is that also kind of a symptom where the body has a need?
I'll answer that two different ways. One is anytime someone is concerned about their symptoms, they feel like they're suffering with their symptoms, that is enough of a reason to go see a therapist. You don't need any more reason other than, I wonder if I could get help with this. And go find a grief-informed therapist, a trauma therapist, someone who's been trained in those modalities, and ask them that question. And it won't be a wasted hour. So it's really important for people to know that suffering is a choice, that there are tools. It doesn't mean you're not going to grieve. You're absolutely going to grieve. That is for you to carry. But in terms of memory loss, that's a big one for people. What is going on? I can't remember the day my dad died, my uncle's first name. And often people just sort of talk about it as a brain fog. So there's two ways to think about it. One is sort of the neuroscience and the biological component of it, which is similar to what we've talked about. The brain has a small part called the amygdala, which is in the limbic system, and essentially it enlarges. And when it enlarges, it's kind of like a giant bouncer standing in front of the door to a club. It like decides who's going to get inside. And it is only interested in coding information either as a threat or not a threat. It's not doing a lot of analysis on anything else. So it's letting in almost as little as possible because it doesn't want you to code memories of this terrible thing that's happening to you. So people who've had traumatic events will tell you that they have very specific, very concrete memories. They can remember the smell. They can remember the taste. They can remember the temperature. I think about 9/11 when people talk about that clear blue day. That's because we grieve with our bodies, that we have a 5 senses experience of living. And that's how we take in information. That brain fog is actually part of your brain trying to prevent that from happening, trying to allow you to not code so that you won't, the word we often use is triggered, but you won't be pulled back by a clear blue day into that sensation of terror and relive it. And when you're doing that, we call that PTSD and we define that as trauma. Most people who are grieving will grieve sort of in a forward trajectory and get pulled back on hard days and the smell of a perfume. People who are traumatized by the grief, they will get pulled back often. They will relive that terrible moment of getting that phone call, and the symptoms don't really begin to abate. They might even get worse.
Interesting. And is that the same with trouble sleeping as well as memory loss?
So the trouble sleeping, it's like the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. There are whole kinds of other parts of your brain, but the two that really do us the most damage by getting dysregulated are the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, it has some neurotransmitters, and its responses are based on feeling relaxed and giving you a sense of satiation and calm. And when it can't do that, the things that you would do when you are calm are more difficult to do.
Makes
so
sense, yeah.
Some grievers will tell you they can't sit still, they can't stop running around, they can't, but not being able to sleep is a very standard, very common symptom that typically begins to abate over time. People get more rest.
So in addition to people that have trouble sleeping, the other side of it is that people may be sleeping more often. Is that the same thing?
It's actually different. So we call it sleep disruption. But one thing that I think is really fascinating, and I have been comforted to know, is that the brain actually has 2 different sides that have 2 different purposes. And I don't mean, oh, you're more mathematical or you're more creative. The right side of our brain is the sympathetic nervous system, and it's the activation side. So for many people, what happens when there is a trauma is we go into fight, flight, and what we call high freeze. All of those are high activation sides. Essentially, we're trying to fight against the thing that's happening. We're trying to resist it. When those things don't work, we go through those in a progression: fight, flight, freeze. When they don't work, we go into collapse. That is the other side of the brain. That's the parasympathetic nervous system, the left side. And think of that when an animal is being attacked and then it plays dead. Freeze is, deer in headlights. Collapse is, I'm just hoping to survive. When people are not able to get out of bed, they're more in a collapse state. And the reason this matters is that when we go towards intervention, how do we help people grieve? If you are in an activated, anxious state, we're going to give you different things to do to bring your body back down to neutral than if you haven't gotten out of bed for 10 days. And often people are turning to magazines that are doing an article on grief, and they'll say, take a bubble bath or go for a walk. But if you haven't gotten out of bed for 5 days, taking a bubble bath is actually back into that more depressed energy. It's not going to help. But a walk really would. If you haven't slept in a bunch of days, maybe we're going to say, let's get you in some warm water. Let's try to soothe your muscles.
Is there also a time where it's keep letting your body sleep because it needs it?
Such a good question. Because again, grief is not something that we're supposed to be solving. It's not a problem. It's a developmental thing that we will all go through. And we do have to trust the wisdom of our bodies. What I think about when you ask that question is when people are low energy, when they're more in that collapse state, often what you're finding are people around who are concerned. So this is where making sure that the whole picture, the support systems are well educated, because there's some love in saying his dad just died, let him sleep. But when you think about the mind-body connection, too much sleep, too much inertia is not good for the body to balance the energy. So letting that team, educating everyone so that they know they're not going to want to take a walk with you. But it's really important to have bilateral stimulation, which is movement on both sides of the body, so that we can begin to balance the brain. So even if all you can do is get them to get up out of bed and do cross boxing or 10 jumping jacks with you, you are helping. And that's what a lot of people who are trying to love on their people, they don't know what the things are that are helping. And we can say, if your person has low energy and you're concerned about that, get in there, just say, it's going to be good for you. Let's take a little walk together.
That actually brings us to our next symptom, which is, grievers often have unpredictable moods. Is there a reason for that? Where does the unpredictable moods come into play?
So I love the word unpredictable because people generally have a sense of themselves. When my mom died, it was really hard for me to be around other people because I knew who they thought I was. And I didn't feel like that anymore. And so it was difficult to be across from someone who was sort of mirroring, an old version of myself. The volatility or the unpredictability of the moods has to do with what the brain is trying to do. So the brain is essentially a prediction tool. It takes its past experiences and brings up those screens and tries to apply them to what it's doing right now. So when you go to drink a cup of lemonade, your brain is already teaching your system, your tongue to anticipate that sour lemon because you've done it before. The body and the brain don't really love novelty. It's actually what we call energetically expensive. So we like to avoid that. And it's why new routines are difficult, and it's why people can sort of, avoid things that are good for them. We have no choice. And so a lot of what I talk to grievers about, especially in those early, fresh grief days, is don't make decisions that are more than maybe 3 hours ahead, because that mood and that volatility, how you feel right now, could dramatically shift in 3 hours. And so just by giving the advice, I'm trying to make room for the normative experience of the up and down. That you may have energy now, you may be dead to the world exhausted in 3 hours.
Could you give advice to those people that I think you've said before, grief adjacent, or those that are in the supporting side of grief, so that we can kind of speak to their needs as well?
When you're grief adjacent, so you're not the person who's grieving, it's your spouse who's lost their parent, you still have your own emotions of grief. Yours aren't nullified by being a supporter. And as in my case, my anger was pretty biting. I didn't have a lot of control over it. And honestly, in some instances, I sort of liked when it hurt other people. I liked sort of offsetting my pain on other people. I don't feel proud of that, but again, I think that's kind of normal. And I want to say to the people who want to be there for their grievers, it's also really important to make sure that that's okay for you. That just because you're the person who is the closest doesn't mean that it's a self-sacrificing experience. So if it's not good for you, then you bring in more supporters. Then you spread the weight of that. I have people who have had traumatic experiences in their childhood around anger or around lots of sadness or around what looks like depression. And it's really provocative to them to have people close to them now in that space suddenly. And so I just want to say that to the people who are doing the support, that it's important to remember that, yeah, we're telling our grievers every 3 hours, but it's almost like the fire brigade, like who's backing you up with the bucket? Because your grief adjacent, it didn't happen to you, but you're in it and you are feeling those feelings. And I think it's important to say it out loud sooner rather than later so that people understand that when it feels like people you love were not there for you while you were grieving, that it isn't always because they didn't love you right. Some of that might be they're protecting themselves, they're good boundaries for themselves. I like to sort of remind folks that there are lots of developmental stages in our lives where our friendships shift and pivot, and maybe it's not so painful if you go to a different high school than your best friend from 7th grade and you don't hate them for it. But in grief, it is a developmental phase. Your life is changing. It already feels terrible, so it's pretty terrible to lose friends, but it is also typical.
Thank you for watching part 1 of Grief in the Body. Please select the part 2 video on the forgrief.com website.